The snow was not falling, it was swallowing. The whole prairie had vanished beneath a white that felt less like weather, more like judgment. Wind drove ice against her face so hard it stung like thrown salt. Each breath cut her throat on the way in, then burned on the way out. Maylan kept walking because stopping meant dying. It was that simple. Her dress had once been pink, a pale, foolish color chosen by a merchant in San Francisco who said American men liked wives who looked soft. Now the cotton clung to her skin in frozen rags, stained with mud, stiff with sleet, useless against the cold that had already chewed through her feet and climbed into her bones. She could no longer feel her toes. That frightened her less than the warmth. The warmth was always worse. The warmth was the body beginning to surrender. Behind her lay the settlement, a cluster of shacks, and the saloon crouched at the edge of nowhere. 3 months ago she had arrived there with a husband she barely knew, a man who had promised land, safety, a stove that always had wood. He died before the first hard freeze. He left debts. And in places like that, a dead man's debts did not die with him. They passed to whatever he had owned, his horse, his tools, his widow. Vance had smiled when he explained it, not cruelly, that was the worst part, as if he were speaking of weather or cattle or some ordinary fact of frontier life. Your husband owed money. You can pay another way. Maylan had seen the way the other men looked at her after that, not as a woman, not even as prey, as inventory, a thing to be divided, a thing to be used until the numbers were made right. So she ran, not with a plan, not with enough food, just with a dress too thin for winter, feet wrapped in rags, and the animal certainty that if she stayed another night, she would never belong to herself again. The snow deepened. Once she sank to her knee, then to her thigh, and had to claw her way back up with numb hands. Her breath came ragged now. Her lashes were heavy with frost. The wind kept the same gentle lie. Lie down, just for a moment. The snow is soft. The cold will stop hurting soon. She almost listened. Then she saw it. Far ahead, so small she thought at first it was a trick of frozen eyes, a single gold light trembled against the dark line of the foothills. A window, a lantern, a house, life. Everything inside her that had already begun to shut down turned toward that light. She fixed her eyes on it and made a bargain with her own body. One more step, then another, and another. The world narrowed until nothing existed but white wind, black sky, and that impossible little square of gold. Sometimes the ground held her. Sometimes it gave way and swallowed half her leg. Once she fell hard enough that the breath burst out of her, and she stayed on her hands and knees longer than she should have. But the light remained, waiting. As the house finally took shape, it looked less like shelter than defiance. A dark timber cabin, stone chimney, smoke breathing steadily into the storm. A covered porch with a neat stack of split wood under canvas. No barn close by, no second house, no family noise. Just one ranch house standing alone in a field of white. A lone man's place. That should have frightened her more. Maybe it did. A lone man could be merciful. A lone man could be monstrous. Out here there would be no witness either way. But fear was a luxury. Warmth was not. By the time she reached the porch, walking was no longer possible. The 3 wooden steps loomed in front of her like a mountain. She dropped to her hands and knees and crawled them one by one, the rough boards scraping through soaked cloth and frozen skin. At the top she saw the door, solid, dark, final. She raised her hand to knock. Her fingers brushed the wood and forgot how to move. The light in the window blurred. The porch tilted beneath her. She thought, absurdly, that at least if she died here, it would be near a fire. Then everything went dark. When the door opened, she felt it before she heard it. Warm air rolled over her face in a wave so rich with wood smoke and coffee, it felt like a memory from another life. Someone stood above her, tall, broad-shouldered, only a shadow against the golden room behind him. She tried to speak, to offer something, an explanation, a warning, a bargain, anything. But all that came out was a dry, broken gasp. The man knelt. One large hand settled carefully on her shoulder. She flinched on instinct. Even half frozen, the body remembered. But the touch did not tighten, did not claim, did not test. It only steadied, warm, gentle. He said nothing. With the calm efficiency of a man used to lifting heavy things, he gathered her into his arms and carried her inside. She weighed almost nothing. She knew that from the ease of it. The door shut behind them with a heavy thud, sealing out the storm. The cabin smelled of firewood, leather, coffee, and the deep, clean loneliness of a place built for one person only. A big hearth dominated the room. There was a table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed against the wall. Everything plain, everything orderly. The man lowered her onto a thick bearskin rug before the fire. Heat hit her face so suddenly it hurt. He moved around her in silence, returned with a wool blanket, and wrapped it around her shoulders with brisk, impersonal care. Not tenderness, not cruelty. Competence. Only then did she finally see his face. Weathered, bearded, gray eyes serious as winter water. A man perhaps 35. Though grief had added years the mirror could not count. He set a tin cup to her lips. Coffee. Black. Bitter. Burning hot. She drank. The heat went through her like pain, then like life. For a long time the only sounds in the cabin were the crackle of the fire, the wind battering the walls, and her own violent shivering as blood returned to hands and feet. The rancher sat nearby with a rifle across his lap and watched her without staring. like a man waiting to decide what kind of trouble had blown to his door. At last, when she could trust her voice not to break apart in her mouth, she looked straight at him and offered the only thing she had left. "I have no money," she whispered. "No family." She swallowed. Shame tasted like rust, but shame did not matter any more. "I am not worth much," she said, "but I'll marry you for a warm bed." Caleb did not answer her. The words she had spoken hung in the warm air between them, crude, desperate, impossible to take back. "I'll marry you for a warm bed." Most men would have laughed. Some would have taken the offer before the sentence finished. Others might have thrown her out into the snow for the insult. Caleb did none of those things. He simply watched her, gray eyes steady, unreadable, weighing the words like a man considering the value of something broken but not yet useless. The fire cracked behind her. A log shifted. Maylan felt the heat on her back, the shame on her face. She had meant every word. That was the worst part. At last, Caleb moved. Not toward her, toward the stove. "Eat," he said. The single word landed like a stone. It was not approval. It was not refusal. It was something else entirely. He filled a wooden bowl with thick stew and set it beside her on the rug. Beef, potatoes, carrots. Simple food meant to keep a body alive through winter. The smell alone nearly made her dizzy. She hesitated. A lifetime of caution whispering that kindness always came with a price. Caleb noticed. "If I meant to hurt you," he said quietly, "I wouldn't have carried you inside." The statement was so simple, so brutally honest, that the last of her resistance collapsed. She ate, not like a lady, not like a wife, like someone who had been hungry too long. Caleb sat back in his chair with the rifle across his knees and watched the storm claw at the cabin walls. He had seen desperate people before. The frontier produced them the way winter produced snow. But this one was different. She had offered marriage the way another person might offer a coin, or a horse, or a coat. Not as romance, as currency. That told him everything he needed to know about the life she had fled. When the bowl was empty, she set it carefully on the floor and looked up at him again, waiting. Caleb leaned forward slightly. "How long since you ate last?" She thought. 2 days. He nodded once, not surprised. "The storm will last another 3, maybe 4. He gestured toward the rug. "You can stay by the fire until it passes." Relief hit her so suddenly it almost made her light-headed. But then came the rest. "When the weather clears," Caleb continued, "I'll take you back to the settlement." The words struck her like cold water. "No!" It came out sharper than she intended. Caleb's eyebrow lifted slightly. "You can't go back?" Maylan lowered her gaze to the blanket around her shoulders. Her fingers twisted the wool nervously. "My husband died," she said quietly. "He owed money." Caleb waited. "In that town," she continued, "men believe debts must be paid." Her voice hardened. "They believe I am the payment." The wind slammed against the cabin walls. For a long moment Caleb said nothing. Then he asked a single question. "Vance?" Her head snapped up. "You know him?" "I know the kind." Caleb's mouth tightened slightly. "Men who build power in small towns. Men who mistake cruelty for strength." The firelight shifted across his face. For the first time, Maylan saw something there beyond caution. Not pity, recognition. Finally, Caleb stood. He took the empty bowl, rinsed it in a basin, and set it beside the stove. When he turned back, his decision had already been made. "You'll stay here until the storm ends." Her breath caught. "And after?" she asked softly. Caleb shrugged once. "We'll decide when we get there." It wasn't acceptance. It wasn't marriage. But it was more than she had dared hope. Outside, the storm howled like a living thing. Inside the small cabin, two strangers sat beside the fire, both carrying ghosts, both too tired to face the world alone. The storm did not weaken. It grew heavier. For 3 days the world outside the cabin disappeared behind a wall of white wind and snow. The prairie, the hills, even the fence posts vanished beneath the endless blizzard. Inside the cabin, time moved differently, slow, measured, quiet. Caleb rose before the sun each morning. The routine never changed. Boots on, coat, hat. Then he disappeared into the small barn attached to the back of the cabin to tend the livestock. Maylan would hear the sounds through the wall, the shuffle of hooves, the creak of a stall door, the quiet murmur of a man speaking softly to animals who understood him better than people did. He always returned with snow on his shoulders and frost in his beard, and every time he came back inside, he paused at the door, as if making sure the stranger in his house was still there. At first they spoke little, not out of hostility, but because neither of them had lived a life that encouraged many words. He left food near the hearth, stew, bread, sometimes dried venison. One morning she found something folded neatly on the chair, an oversized wool shirt, a pair of rough work trousers. Her pink dress hung useless beside the fire where it had been drying for 2 days. The thin fabric looked almost ridiculous now, like something from a life that belonged to someone else. She put on the clothes he left. They were far too large for her. The sleeves swallowed her hands, but the heavy wool felt like armor. That afternoon she swept the floor, not because he asked, but because she needed to offer something in return for the warmth he had given her. Caleb noticed. He said nothing, but later he set an extra piece of bread beside her bowl. It was the closest thing to thanks either of them knew how to say. By the second evening, the silence between them had softened. Not gone, just less sharp. She watched him while he cleaned his rifle beside the fire. The movements were careful, practiced, almost meditative. A man who had done the same task 1,000 times. "You live here alone?" she asked quietly. Caleb did not look up. "I do." "For how long?" His hands paused. The cloth froze halfway along the rifle barrel. 8 winters. The number hung in the room like a shadow. "My wife died," he added. The words came without emotion, flat, like a fact carved into stone. "And my daughter." Maylon felt the air shift. She followed his gaze. There, on a small shelf near the bed, sat a faded ribbon. Pink, the kind a young girl might tie in her hair. No pictures, no toys, just that ribbon. "I am sorry," she said softly. Caleb gave a small nod, then continued cleaning the rifle. Conversation finished. But something had changed. That night the storm screamed louder than before. The cabin walls groaned under the weight of the wind. Maylon pretended to sleep on the bearskin rug, but sometime in the night she heard Caleb stand from his bed. He walked to the window and stood there a long time, looking out into the blizzard. She heard him sigh once, a sound so heavy with loneliness it made her chest ache. 2 people in the same room, 2 lives hollowed out by loss. By the 4th morning, the storm finally died. The silence was almost shocking. Sunlight spilled through the window, cold and pale. Outside, the world was reborn. White hills, long shadows, a sky sharp and blue above the frozen prairie. Caleb stood at the window, watching the horizon. He had the look of a man who knew storms were rarely the worst danger on the frontier. Behind him, Maylon felt the familiar knot of dread return to her stomach. "They will come," she whispered. Caleb didn't turn around. "I know." Because men like Vance never forgot a debt, and never forgave someone who escaped paying it. The storm had hidden her, but now the sky was clear, and the world would begin looking again. The silence after the storm did not last long. By afternoon, the snow had settled into smooth white drifts, and the sky above the prairie had turned the cold blue of sharpened steel. Caleb spent the morning clearing a path from the cabin to the barn. Each shove of the shovel was slow and steady, a man working, but also watching. Maylon stood by the window. Her eyes searched the horizon the way a hunted animal listens for footsteps. It was almost peaceful, too peaceful. Then she saw them. 3 dark shapes on horseback, small at first, moving slowly across the distant hills. Her stomach dropped. "They're here," she whispered. Caleb didn't rush. He didn't curse. He simply leaned the shovel against the porch rail and stepped inside. "How many?" he asked. 3. He nodded once. Like a man hearing weather reports he had expected all along. Caleb walked to the table, opened the small wooden ammunition box. The quiet clicks of rifle cartridges dropping into his palm filled the cabin. Meilon watched him, her heart beating harder with each movement. "You don't have to do this," she said softly. He slid one cartridge into the rifle, then another. "I know." She stepped closer. "They want me, not you." Caleb looked up, his gray eyes calm, steady, immovable. "This is my land." The answer was simple and final. Outside, the riders grew larger. The sound of hooves carried clearly now across the frozen prairie. Meilon recognized the man in front even before his face became visible. Vance. He rode with the same confidence he always carried in the settlement, the confidence of a man who believed the world already belonged to him. Two others rode behind him, Jedediah, Bo, both men known more for violence than work. They stopped at the edge of the yard. Snow crunched under the horses' weight. Vance smiled when he saw the cabin door open. "Well now," he called, "looks like the little China doll found herself a place to hide." Caleb stepped onto the porch. His frame filled the doorway, blocking the entrance. "She ain't hidin'," he said. "She's staying." Vance laughed, a short, ugly sound. "You know who that girl belongs to, Caleb?" Caleb didn't answer. "Her husband owed me money," Vance continued, "and in this part of the country, debts get paid." He leaned slightly in the saddle, trying to see past Caleb into the cabin. "Now be a good neighbor and send her out." The wind stirred loose snow across the porch. Caleb's voice stayed level. "She ain't your property." Vance's smile faded. "She is if the debt says she is." One of the men behind him chuckled. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," Vance said. "She's not worth dying for." Caleb's gray eyes hardened. "That's where you're wrong." The words hung in the frozen air. Jedediah shifted in the saddle, his hand resting near the grip of his pistol. Bo grinned, enjoying the tension. Vance's patience cracked. "You really planning to start a war over her?" he sneered. Caleb didn't raise his voice, didn't move, but the rifle resting in his hands said enough. "This is my home," he said quietly, "and I don't let men like you decide what happens on my porch." The air grew still, heavy with the promise of violence. For a moment, no one moved. Then Vance spat into the snow. "You're a stubborn fool, Caleb." He turned his horse slightly. "But that's all right. We'll be back tonight." Toward the woman slid toward the cabin door. "And when we come back, we're taking what's mine." The three riders turned their horses, snow spraying under the hooves as they rode away. Caleb watched them until the dark shapes disappeared over the ridge. Only then did he step back inside the cabin. The door closed. The heavy bar slid into place. Meilon stood in the center of the room, her hands trembling. "They will come back," Caleb nodded. I know. Outside, the winter sun slowly began to sink, painting the snow in long purple shadows. Night was coming, and with it, the real fight. Night came fast on the prairie. The last light of the sun faded behind the hills, leaving only a pale moon hanging over the frozen land. Inside the cabin, the lantern was out. Only the fire glowed low in the hearth. Caleb sat beside the window, rifle resting across his knees, still, silent, watching. Melan knelt near the fireplace, the heavy iron poker gripped tightly in both hands. It was the only weapon she had. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to say. Outside, the prairie looked peaceful. White snow, silver moonlight, endless silence. But peace on the frontier was often the moment just before violence. Then it came, a faint sound, crunch, crunch, crunch. Hoofbeats. 3 shadows emerged from the dark line of trees, slow, careful, spreading apart as they approached the cabin. Vance's voice carried through the cold night air. "Last chance, Caleb. Send the girl out, and you get to live." The answer was silence. Then a gunshot cracked through the night. Vance fired into the air. A warning, a promise. Caleb did not move, his rifle already resting against the window frame, his breathing slow, measured. One of the riders, Bo, suddenly kicked his horse forward, charging straight toward the cabin, pistol raised. The night exploded. Caleb's rifle thundered. The horse screamed, rearing violently. Bo flew from the saddle and vanished into the deep snow. One down. A second gunshot blasted through the window. Glass shattered across the floor. Melan dropped flat to the ground, heart hammering in her chest. Outside, Jedediah cursed loudly. "Burn him out!" Vance shouted. "Get the lantern!" Melan looked toward the door. Her breath stopped. Jedediah was climbing off his horse, a lantern in one hand, matches in the other. Fire. They were going to burn the cabin, burn them alive inside it. Caleb couldn't see him. His rifle was trained on Vance. Melan's mind moved faster than her fear. If that lantern reached the cabin, it was over. Her fingers tightened around the iron poker. Then she moved. She rushed to the door, lifting the heavy wooden bar with shaking hands. The door burst open. Cold wind flooded the room. Melan screamed, a raw, fierce cry that ripped through the night. She charged straight at Jedediah. The poker swung hard. Metal slammed into his arm. The lantern fell from his hand, hissing uselessly in the snow. Jedediah howled in pain. Caleb fired. The rifle crack echoed across the frozen valley. Jedediah collapsed beside the dropped lantern. Now only Vance remained. The man stared at the scene in disbelief. Snow, bodies, the woman standing in front of the cabin. His face twisted with rage. He raised his pistol, aiming directly at Melan. She froze, the black circle of the gun barrel staring back at her. Time slowed. The flash came first, but the bullet never reached her. Caleb slammed into her from the side, both of them crashing onto the wooden porch. The shot tore into the cabin wall behind them. Caleb rolled to one knee, rifle already lifting. One final shot split the night. Vance jerked in the saddle, then slumped forward over his horse's neck. The horse panicked, bolting into the darkness, carrying the lifeless body away. And suddenly there was silence. Deep, absolute, final. Melan lay on the porch, breathing hard, her hands shaking violently. Caleb stood beside her, the rifle hanging loosely in his grip. He offered his hand. She took it. He pulled her gently to her feet. The two of them stood there in the moonlight, surrounded by the quiet aftermath of violence. "Are you hurt?" he asked. She shook her head, but then she noticed it, a dark stain spreading across his sleeve. "You're bleeding." Caleb glanced down, almost indifferent. "Just a graze." Inside the cabin, she cleaned the wound carefully. Cloth, whiskey, steady hands. He didn't flinch once. When she finished, she knelt in front of him, her hands resting on his knees. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Caleb said quietly, "Your offer. The one you made that first night." Melan's breath caught. "I said I would marry you for a warm bed," she whispered. Caleb nodded slowly. "A warm bed's not a bad thing," he said. "But a man might do even better, with a brave wife beside him." A small smile touched the corner of his mouth. "If you'll have me." He said her name gently. Melan. Tears filled her eyes, warm tears, for the first time in a long while. "Yes," she whispered. Outside, the snow began falling again, soft, quiet, covering the scars left in the frozen earth. And for the first time since she crossed the ocean, Melan finally had something she had not dared hope for. A home.